Okay, so in chapter 29, we turn our attention in this final chapter to the last group of organisms we want to talk about, the vertebrates. Right? We've gone through all of the different groups of life, all the different types of animals, but now we move on to those animals you can clearly see in this one that's apparently been fossilized. You can clearly see a vertebral column. That's a unique characteristic of these organisms. Now, diversity, there's a lot of different types of vertebrates out there, but when it comes to comparison to some of the other diversity and some of the other groups, well, we got 57,000 species of vertebrates here. And if you think about what in the flowers, the flowering plants were 250,000 different species. So it's a relative kind of thing, right? But there is an extreme amount of diversity. Look up at the top, you see the Echinodermata. Those are our closest relatives. We've talked about that. It was that bilateral larvae of the Echinodermata that gave us an indication that maybe something happened, that it evolved, not in, or the larvae through transformation back in time evolved into some bilateral organism. And so that's where we get the break off into the cephalochordates, and that's the Amphioxus that we talked about. And those are all called chordates because they have a chord, but they aren't all vertebrates. Notice that there's a line on the right that differentiates between something that has a chord, like a notochord, for example, and somebody that has a vertebral column made of maybe cartilage or, as you can see in the shark, or a bone. We'll go through each one of these groups and we'll talk about each of these characteristics as they arise, but down in the bottom I want to kind of get the overall scheme of what's going on. First vertebrates appeared about 545 million years ago. If you remember, I've been saying all along in this semester, that's during the time of the Cambrian explosion. So the Cambrian explosion was an explosion of many different forms of life, not just some of the early forms of life. Even the vertebrates were already on the scene about this time. The earliest ones were jawless fish, and we still have a few of those around. The Myxinae that you see up there right below it, the Petromyzontida, those are lampreys and hagfish, and they are jawless fish. But then later on, the jawless fish we call agnatha, because natha is a jaw, so we put an A in front of it. Agnatha, no jaw. Jaws are gnathostome. Stome is mouth, and natha means now you have a jawed mouth. What's so important about that? Why do I put an exclamation point? Well, at that time in history, when these organisms evolved jaws, that really changed everything. It became a very much of an arms race, because if you think about it, if you got jaws, now you can eat lots of different things, and that means lots of different things that get eaten are going to have to find their ways to protect themselves, right? And that's all the evolution we've been dealing with all semester long. Now, in very broad steps, it was, of course, the fish are in the water, but there were some transitional organisms that we'll get to that have moved out on the land. Eventually, the amphibians invaded the land, but they were limited in their distribution because they could only reproduce in water, right, for the difference in the eggs that we'll look at a little bit later on. The reptiles changed that egg and allowed that egg to be laid in areas that are dry, so they have an amniotic sac, if you remember me talking about that, so that only were they able to reproduce on land, but they were able to produce on land away from water. So as the environment on Earth changed, and just about this time when the dinosaurs were coming into their own 250 million years ago, the world had been, Pangea was forming, and the Earth was changing. There were some drier areas, so some diversity, some organisms that could live in drier areas could take advantage of that. The birds and the mammals, well, the birds were around. I put in question marks there. The birds are not on that list. You'll notice that now that we're using the modern technology, and birds are reptiles. So birds, reptilian birds, dinosaur-like birds were around. Mammals were around during this time as well. They just weren't very prominent. It wasn't until after the Cretaceous extinction, about 65 to 66 million years ago, that when the dinosaurs went extinct, that the birds and the mammals and really rose to prominence, because the dinosaurs were a pretty intense group to deal with when you think about predator-prey relationships and that sort of stuff. All right, let's start with what a chordate is first. Get that out. A chordate is someone or something that has a chord. The nearest relatives of chordates are the echinoderms, and we get that information, or we inform that information, from the fact that we both developed the same way. Deuterostomes were the only two groups, the chordates and the echinoderms, that do it that way. and the bilateral larvae of an echinoderm. Even though they might end up with that pentaradial symmetry, their larvae is bilateral. In evolutionary biology, things that are similar when they're younger indicates a similarity of relationship. And also little changes when organisms are in larval stages or embryonic stages can have great effects later on. You'll see what I mean in well, actually on this slide. If you look at there on the right in the middle, you see I've got a fish, a salamander, a tortoise, chicken, rabbit, and man. And if we start from the very top to the bottom, that's the progress of development. You notice when at the very top, they all look very similar, don't they? They have gill slits. We talked about that, and the tails, and of course, if you have gill slits, they become gills. And if you have gill slits and you don't have gills when you're like us, or a rabbit, or a chicken, or a tortoise, some salamanders have gills. Then what those becomes is muscles of the neck and that sort of stuff, nerves, and part of what I say, the eustachian tube the other day. But look at that picture down below. You see the chicken embryo and the human embryo. Pharyngeal pouches are also gill slits, same thing. So that's a human on the right and a chicken on the left. They look very similar developmental forms, right? So that's an indication of a relationship. And so if we go back to the echinoderms, their larvae is bilateral, and it later becomes pentaradial. So maybe that bilateral larvae evolved into something that gave rise to organisms that are bilateral, like we see in this picture here. We talked about this in class the other day, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but if you're a chordate, what makes you a chordate, just like all those characteristics of the different groups we've talked about, like, what makes you a cnidarian and what makes you a flatworm and that sort of stuff. But if you're a chordate, you all have, at least at some time during their life, and I've hinted to this, you all have a dorsal nerve cord. Dorsal is unique. Remember the worms? They thought they might be ancestors. We all have a notochord at some time in our life, okay? In some organisms, that's been replaced by a vertebral column, made of bone or made of cartilage, like in our buddy the shark. And in human beings, it's been reduced to the components of the discs. If you slip a disc, that's your notochord. That's what's left of your notochord. A notochord did its job. It was a stiffening rod, and it worked very well for smaller organisms, like in the lower left is a very simplified picture of our buddy the Amphioxus. You see, it's got a notochord. I've labeled the 4 chordate traits in red there. It was a stiffening rod, but you can only get so big. It wasn't later on until bones and cartilage allowed these organisms to get even bigger. We all had pharyngeal gill slits. You can see what I told you they become in the humans. Obviously, in those that need gills, they become those. And a postanal tail, which gets reabsorbed in human beings, although we do have remnants of that. Another characteristics of chordates are something called somites. If you look in the picture of the chicken and the human embryo, you see like that. What you see is segmentation, don't you? Right? Somites are segmentation. Again, segmentation is a characteristic that pops up many times in organisms. It doesn't mean they're related to one another necessarily, but segmentation allows you to specialize, allows you to be flexible and move, and all those things that we talked about. Those somites that you see in those pictures in the chicken and the human embryo are eventually going to give rise to the muscle, the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton is your vertebral column as opposed to your appendicular skeleton, which is your bones of your arms and legs, tendons, and that sort of stuff. But again, that's an interesting observation of segmentation there. So who are the chordates? Well, we know the big ones, the fish and the amphibians, anything with a backbone, but ones you might not know as well about are the tunicates and the lancelets. So let's kind of work our way to those things leading up to the chordates. So I'm going to talk about Amphioxus or the Cephalochordata, and then I'm going to get into in this first slide all the way up into the cranium part. We'll do that in the next slide. So through the Urochordata. So I'll keep these a little bit shorter. The cephalochordates. Chordate doesn't mean you have a vertebral column. It means you have a rod, okay, a notochord, at least at some time in your life. We're chordates because our notochord became the discs, right? Cephalochordates, like the Amphioxus, that organism that we looked at, is a chordate because, look over on the left, it has a notochord. Now, it just happens to have kept that notochord throughout its entire life. life. It never got rid of it. It serves its purposes. It doesn't need it. It's got a notochord. It's got a dorsal nerve cord. Again, another characteristic of chordates. It has pharyngeal or gill slits, and it has a postanal tail. And I throw the somites in there too, the muscle blocks, the segmentation. That's how they live. Remember, they weren't very big. They live down in the sand, and they're planktivorous, suspension feeders, so they feed on plankton. Somebody asked me if they had cephalization yesterday, and I kind of hinted at that. So they don't really have a distinguishable head, but they do have a front. So we would say somewhat cephalized, maybe. That front has got those oral hood with tentacles, and that's what indicates to us, you can't really see them in the real ones, that they're filter feeders, right? Very closely related to the vertebrates, maybe as old as about 550 million years. So these are some of the first vertebrates that arose on the scene. And interestingly enough, these organisms look very much the way they did back then, which says a lot about where they live. It probably hasn't changed a whole lot. So these are the lancelets, the branchiostoma, or the amphioxus. Those words are confusing, but they mean the same thing. They're synonyms. What I wanted to show you in the upper right is the fact that among the chordates, there's two groups that are the non-vertebrate chordates, and this is the first one. We'll look at the urochordates in the second. And then there's a group of the chordates that you're much more familiar with, which are the craniata. We'll do that in later slides. So now that we've seen our buddy the amphioxus, let's look at something even more strange that you're related to. These are the urochordates, and the urochordates have a notochord, but that's what they look like right there. They look like a sac. These are the tunicates. These are urochordates. Urochordates have a very interesting adult appearance. A salp is a urochordate. The salp is actually the critter, that little yellow thing at the bottom, and all the rest of that is a mucus net. They float through the water and capture their food that way. Tunicates you'll find sometimes growing on the edges of pilings near wharfs and stuff. It looks like a sac. The one on the right in the orange, it's got an in-current and an ex-current siphon. It's got an atrium. It's got the pharyngeal slits. It's got, not as an adult necessarily, but at some time in their life, remember? At some time in its life, it had a notochord, a dorsal nerve cord, a postanal tail, and pharyngeal slits. Now, when it had those characteristics, it was a larvae. That little orange thing in the middle looks like a spot of something or other. That's the larvae of one of these urochordates. They're tadpole-like. They have a notochord, a nerve cord. They swim around. They're dispersing, right? They don't live very long. They don't even feed, and they eventually settle down. They lose their adults without a tail. They lose their tail. They lose the notochord. You don't have to keep it forever. And they become immobile filter feeders. The sac around them is called a tunic, made of cellulose, by the way. So there's an interesting convergent evolution. Only in the ocean. Only marine, exclusively marine. So these are the tunicates and the salps. So down on the bottom again, just to make sure you understand, what A becomes B. The tunicate larvae looks like, if you let me, some license here, looks kind of like a fish a little bit, right? So what may have happened, I don't know why I got so excited about that, is a tunicate or a urochordate larvae, like this one on the left, evolved and became a fish instead of becoming a tunicate. Now, I'm really skipping a lot of steps, but in little incremental changes, we think that's maybe what led, not, to the rest of the vertebrates, which looks a little bit more like the tadpole on the left than it does on the critter on the right, doesn't it? All right, I'm going to stop the recording there, and that'll be for the first part.